I think you're on mute, Shelley, if you're...
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I'm on. I had to actually download Zoom, which I've never had to do that before to attend Zoom. So.
Oh, okay. Glad you're here. No problem. So I'll kick things off. So firstly, thanks to all the guests that joined. We're really excited about today. The webinar that we're going to be hosting today is a special one in the sense that we're not only connecting the COVID Loan Tracker community with the SBA, but also Gusto, who I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with, is a really large payroll provider and integral in the small business space. Andy Smiles from Gusto will be joining us. And so we're bringing together different parties with different views to answer all the questions. So we're really excited about that. The plan today is to have the SBA, specifically Shelley and Sarah and Roxana, lead covering a deck on PPP Forgiveness, which will cover a lot of sort of basics and nuts and bolts. And then, as usual, after that, we're going to get into Q&A. We have people that are going to be answering Q&A questions in the actual Q&A section of the webinar down here, but then we'll address them verbally, some of them as well at the end. A lot of guests sent in literally hundreds of questions in advance of the webinar, so we'll be addressing those. So to kick off, I just want to ask, so Andy, I wanting to give you a chance to introduce your company and yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Hey, everybody. My name is Andy Smiles. I'm a small business financial consultant and coach. I'm also a contributing author with Gusto. So I'm here sort of on the Gusto side today. And you may have read some of the articles I have written on PPP loan forgiveness. They're sort of floating around. Maybe you haven't, but I've written several articles on PPP loan forgiveness. So that's why I'm here, created some templates to help people get through more of like the long form applications that are a lot of math that I'm sure many of you are not interested in doing. But yeah, so my background is in small business finance and specifically with really like self-employed folks and solopreneurs and stuff like that. And is that sufficient, Duncan?
That's perfect. And what about maybe a bit about what Gusto does?
Yeah, so Gusto is a awesome payroll company. I recommend Gusto to all my clients. And in terms of the PPP loan forgiveness, kind of like topic that we're covering today, Gusto also has a lot of great reports built into their payroll software to really help automate and streamline the PPP loan forgiveness software or process. But Gusto as a whole does payroll and also HR support, HR compliance, just depending on how you work with them.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. So maybe we could use Gusto for hopefully another round of PPP if it happens at some point. Shelley, Roxana, Sarah, do you guys want to introduce yourself and what you do at the SBA briefly?
Sure. So we're with the SBA in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we touch base with you guys over a webinar. You guys are doing some awesome work. It turns out that a lot of people still need help, so that's why we're here today. My name's Sarah Branch, and I do marketing and outreach for the Albuquerque SBA location.
Thanks, Sarah.
And hello, everybody. My name is Roxana Chicas. I am a program support analyst, which basically means that I'm here to assist as well with the PPP and EIDL. I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Thanks, Roxana. And Shelley?
And I'm Shelley Brown. I'm a lender relations specialist covering the state of New Mexico, and I assist lenders and borrowers in training and access to capital.
That's great. Thank you. And Shelley, so we're going to start with your deck to kick off. Do you want me to control the deck, or can you host it, or do you need me to?
You can do it, and I'll just tell you next slide. That'll work.
That's great. Without further ado. All right. Shelley, can you see the screen? I'm hoping
I can, yes.
Okay, great. All right. So here we go into presentation mode. All right. So we did this. You guys know who I am. Andy introduced herself. the team introduce themselves. So here we go.
So thank you for having us and joining us today. Today we're going to go over an overview of the PPP loans and the forgiveness process, and some information on the EIDL information. Next slide. Let me get rid of this first. Oops. Okay. Oh, I lost you somehow.
Oh, you can't see my screen?
Well, I did, but I was trying to minimize. It had everybody's names at the top. So now I have to try to find you back. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
How do I get it in full mode again? Do you know?
So it's maybe.
Oh, there it is. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to start out. First of all, Roxana and Sarah are going to do this portion. And so I'm going to let them take it away on this, and then I'll come in and do the middle, and then they'll come back and do the ending.
Okay, awesome. Then
Okay.
Roxana, service.
All right, so what you see right here is the Sba.gov website. There is a SBA in every state in the United States. If you were to go to the Sba.gov, as shown in this screen, you'll be able to get information where to get local assistance. If you could go to the next slide, please. Here, if you were to go down, you'll be able to get a lender match, an SBA near you, and you could sign up for our email updates on the sba.gov/updates. Here, you'll be able to find any of our resource partners or any lenders in your area and find the SBA near you. We are more than glad to assist you, but definitely reach out to the SBA in your area. Next slide, please. So what this session will cover, as Shelley stated, is going to be the overview of the PPP loan forgiveness platform, and how to submit lender decisions. And at the end, we'll go ahead and hold a Q&A for any questions that are not covered during the whole presentation. Let's see.
Okay, so we have the overview of loan forgiveness, the PPP forgiveness basics, payroll considerations, forgiveness process timeline, borrower documentation, loan forgiveness platform, which is what the lender uses, lender reviews, SBA forgiveness payment, economic injury, and the remaining balance, and what the lenders need to do with that. So next slide, please.
Sure.
So how do you request forgiveness? So there's 3 forms you need to fill out. One is a long form, and then the form 3508 easy form, and that is a form that you would use with no reduction employees, or the newest form, which is a 3508S, and the S form is for businesses that received a PPP loan of $50,000 or less. Again, that's the actual loan of $50,000 or less. So if you got $50,001, you need to use the 3508 easy form. All forms do require supporting documentation. So there's a myth out there that the 3508S was an automatic forgiveness. It is not. You still have to fill out the form and submit supporting documentation to the lender. Again, it's a lender's loan, so you have to submit it to the lender that made you the PPP loan. Which each one of these forms also has instructions, separate instructions for each form. So if you go on to the SBA site or the Treasury site, you'll be able to find the forms both in English and Spanish. The 3508, it'll say form 3508, and then it'll have 3508 instructions. Same with the 3508 easy and the S form. You have a separate form, and then the instructions separate. The instruction page takes you line by line on what is required to fill in for that particular space. Next slide, please. So the PPP forgiveness, what's included in that is your payroll costs. So you need to include at least, or show at least 60% or more was used for payroll costs. You can use up to 100%. They're under that misconception that only 60% can be used, but no, it's 60% or more to be used for payroll costs. The other cost could be the 40% or less for business rent payments, mortgage interest payments, utility payments, all these that were in place prior to February 15th. If you had anything that was up for renewal, for instance, your lease came up for renewal in this forgiveness period, you're able to use it as long as you can show that you've had that lease prior to February 15th, and then you have the extension of it or the renewal of it, then you can count it. Next slide, please. So payroll cost considerations to be eligible for forgiveness. Payroll costs must be incurred or paid during the covered period or alternative payroll covered period. The covered period started out, originally it was 8 weeks. And then because we thought this pandemic was gonna, or everybody thought that it was gonna be a lot sooner, but it wasn't. So we extended that alternative payroll covered for a 24-week period. So that's what the covered period is, and the alternative payroll covered period is. If you use the funds within the covered period of the 8 weeks, then that you can use that figure and submit your forgiveness application to your lender. Number 2 is the incurred before the covered period or alternative payroll covered period, but paid during the covered period or alternative payroll covered period. And then 3, incurred during the covered period or alternative payroll covered period, but paid on or before the next regular payroll date after the covered period or alternative covered period. So there were paydays that were in there that they were earning the paycheck during the covered period or alternative covered period, but maybe it was paid thereafter, but it still is considered as long as it was incurred during that covered period. Next slide, please. The loan forgiveness process time. So the borrower will submit the application and the supporting documentation to the lender. The lender will review the documentation. If the borrower does not submit the forgiveness application within 10 months of the end of the covered period, deferral on the PPP loan ends and the borrower must begin making payments, which means if you do not fill out that form and submit it to the lender within that 10-month period, it will not be forgiven and it turns into the loan at the 1% for the term that it was originally, either to 2 years or 5 years, depending on when you took that loan out. Once you receive that to the lender has 60 days to review the documentation, review the application. If you don't have the supporting documentation, the lender has the right to not accept that application until you bring the supporting documentation, because their 60 days starts the day they actually receive that application. And if there's trailing documentations that needed to be submitted, it will just sit and you're unable to get it submitted for the forgiveness. And then once the lender submits it to SBA, SBA has 90 days to review that and make a determination for the forgiveness and the amount. Next slide, please. The borrower documentation requirements. In addition to the forgiveness form, the 3508 or the EASY or the S form, or the loan may have their equivalent form. You're generally expected to submit the following, which is payroll, proof of payment. So even on the S form, you do have to submit your proof of payroll payment and any non-payroll payments. So proof of obligations and proof of payment. The 3508 needs a Schedule A, and that's the long form. And as it was mentioned, there's a lot of math on that one. And the 3508 EASY is only for full-time equivalent information that's required on that. You no longer have to do that on the 3508S. And then again, for each form, there is instruction forms that accompany all these forms. Any loans that are $2 million or over is automatically subject to SBA loan review, and additional documentation will be required. And the borrower must keep records for at least 6 years, because anytime these loans can be audited by the SBA. So make sure you keep those records in a safe place in the event that does happen. And they are doing them at random. Loans even as low as 20,000 have been. So generally we will reach out to the lender to get their supporting documentation that you submitted. Next, please. Documents must provide proof of eligible costs, so that's bank statements or third-party payroll services providers, reports documenting the amount of cash compensation paid to employees, tax forms, and payment receipts. And then all the instructions tell you acceptable forms for the documents that you can submit. So again, this is for the covered period and alternative covered periods. Next slide, please. The documents must prove eligible costs. So if you're paying the interest on your business mortgage interest, you'll need the amortization schedule and the receipts of what you paid. Same with the lease payments, lease agreements, and receipts, and the utility payments. You'll need the invoices and the receipts proof that you pay it, and or bank statements. You can use those as well. Always double check with your lender to see what they are willing to accept, because again, they're the ones that have to review it and submit it to SBA. Next slide, please. So these are some frequently asked questions that came up. So who can use the SBA Form 3508S forgiveness application? And that's a borrower may use this form only if the borrower received a PPP loan of $50,000 or less. Again, if it's $50,000, $50,001, then it is not eligible. Any borrower that has affiliates and combined received PPP loans totaling of $2 million or greater cannot use this form. So if they have affiliates that took out several loans and just happen to have a loan for, let's say, $40,000, it would not qualify for the 3508S. And then the 3508S requires fewer calculations, so you don't have to calculate the full-time equivalent forms like you had to do on the other ones. And the SBA form does not require borrowers to show calculations used to determine their loan forgiveness amount. So on the easy form and the 3508, there is a calculation. The 3508 easy is a little bit more simple math. The 3508 is complex, but you don't have to fill out that form of the calculations for the 3508S. Next slide, please. What documentations do you need to submit with the 3508S? So you still have to submit the supporting documentation for payroll and any other expenses during the covered period. If you choose to use a 24 period and show that the funds were used within the 24 periods for payroll only, then only payroll documentations will need to be submitted. So if during the 8-week period, let's say you used some of it for some expenses and others for payroll, but then you extend it out for the 24 to use the remainder for payroll, you can count just the payroll for that. If you're claiming other expenses, then you'll need to submit, or you'll have to submit the other forms as well as the payroll. So you can use either one. Next form, please. Or slide, sorry. And the easy form forgiveness, who can use that? Self-employed individuals, individual contractors, sole proprietors who have no employees at the time of the PPP application and did not include any employee salaries in the calculation can use it. Or if the borrower didn't reduce the annual salary or wages of employees by more than 25% during the covered period or alternative covered payroll period, and didn't reduce the number of employees between January 1st and the end of the covered period. Or the borrower didn't reduce salary or wages of any employee by more than 25% during the covered period or alternative period. On number 1, where it says self-employed individuals, independent contractors, and sole proprietors, they also can use Form 3508S. It is not required that they use the easy form. They can use the 3508S as long as it's $50,000 or less. Next slide, please. May a borrower submit a forgiveness application before the end of the covered period? And the answer to that is yes. However, when you're filling out the form, it's going to ask you the covered period and the ending date. It is important that you count your covered period from the time that you received the loan, so the funds were dispersed to you, and the 8 weeks. That would be it. You don't count it. Let's say you used it in 6 weeks. You wouldn't count that 6-week period. You would go the full 8 weeks for your covered period, regardless whether or not you use the funds prior to the end of that 8-week and or 24-week covered period. So that's a tip, because there's been a lot of errors on that. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're filling out your application.
Yes.
Next slide, please.
As well, and we'll get to later.
The borrower forgiveness application, another frequently asked question. The PPP loan forgiveness application forms up at the top, the 3508, the EASY, and the S, have an expiration date of October 31st. There is a misconception out there, some even from lenders, that thought that that was the expiration date. That's when everything needed to be in, and that's not true. That is the expiration date for that form for SBA to be in compliance with the Paperwork Reduction Act and the ADA requirements. So just because there's an expiration date of October 31st, that's not your drop dead date. You can continue to use that. If SBA updates it and extends it, then forms will come out, and then they move forward and use those, but both of them will be accepted. Next slide, please. What should a lender do if a borrower received an EIDL advance in excess of the amount of the PPP? So when you're filling out the applications for and it's all 3 of them, and it will ask how much of an EIDL advance did you receive? You need to put that amount up there. You do not deduct that from the loan, from the PPP loan amount. So for instance, if you got $50,000 and your EIDL advance was $5,000, you do not ask for a loan forgiveness of $45,000. You ask for the loan forgiveness of $50,000. When the lender inputs this into the loan portal, it'll pop up how much advance you did receive, or it should. And then once SBA receives it, we will also verify that amount. So SBA will reduce that amount, the EIDL advance amount, from the PPP loan request. So if a borrower received the EIDL advance in excess of the amount of the PPP loan and they will not receive any forgiveness on the PPP loan, because the amount of the EIDL advance is deducted from the PPP loan forgiveness. And so then at that point, we will respond to the lender. The lender will notify you of the amount that was forgiven and or the balance, and let you know when your first payment is due. And the term would be for what the original term was, depending on when you applied and received the funds, either a 2-year term or a 5-year term. If at any point the borrower is determined to be ineligible for the PPP loan for any reason, SBA may seek repayment from the borrower of any outstanding loan balance. Next slide, please. How can sole proprietors document pay? This is a big hot button right now, and I get a lot of calls from both lenders and borrowers on this. But sole proprietors, we do know that sometimes they intermingle funds with their personal accounts. Some have separate accounts, which that's probably the best way to go. But you're going to have to show that you used some of that PPP to pay yourself. And you can do that by bank account statements, documenting the amount of cash compensated paid, business to personal account. So if you have a business account, you put it into your personal account, you can use that. And then you need to account for expenses. 29 Schedule C compensation caps, which I think the maximum for sole proprietors is a little over $20,000 on a 24-week period. And no forgiveness for home-based businesses' household expenses. So for instance, if you're working out of your home, you cannot claim your electrical bill as part of your forgiveness if you're in a home-based business, because that is considered a household expense. Also, be very aware, this is one of those IRS things. If you're getting reimbursed for the PPP on any of these expenses, and you need to check with your CPA on this, you probably won't be able to deduct them. If you got paid and reimbursed on the PPP and it's been forgiven, then you won't be able to deduct that on your taxes. But again, I'm not a tax expert, I'm not a CPA, so you'll need to check with them and or the IRS. Next slide, please. Loan forgiveness platform. So The lender reviews, when you submit the application, the lender will review the supporting documentation and the application. They can approve it in full and submit it to SBA, or approve it in part. And part would be, let's say you didn't use 60% for payroll. Let's say you only used 50%. They can forgive the 50%, but that extra 10% would still be rolled into the PPP loan. So just remember, that's the magic number. It's 60% or more to hopefully get the full approval for forgiveness. They can also deny it, and they can deny it without prejudice, which generally means that the SBA is reviewing the loan and it's pending for loan forgiveness. Next slide, please.
Just a question. So let's say you get approved in full. You get some sort of document, like we got a note from the SBA note when we took the loan. Do you get some official document that says this has been entirely forgiven?
Yes, the lender will receive the funds, and then it's up to the lenders to send you the information on the amount that was forgiven, and if there's any balance due, what balance is remaining, and what the payment would be, and when the payment will start. So yes, the lender gets it, and then the lender corresponds with the borrower.
Okay, so all that documentation comes from the lender.
Yes. So we communicate that information with the lender, and the lender has access to it through the forgiveness platform. This is for lenders. So let's move on. This is just I took the slide out. I don't know what it's doing in there. But that was just for the platform. The lender submits it through our platform, which is a third-party vendor. And then they can go back into the platform and review it. And that's where they can see with the amount of the EIDL. When SBA remits the forgiveness payment to the lender, we just kind of talked about this, the amount of forgiveness payment is received. And then if it's not 100% forgiven, then the lender will correspond with the borrower when the due date of the first payment is and how much that payment would be. Next slide, please. Okay, another frequently asked question. How will the lender know if the EIDL advance that will automatically be deducted? Again, do not deduct that on your forms. We just found out, I think it was today, that somebody had submitted an application, lender submitted it. The loan was, let's say, $40,000, and their EIDL advance was $4,000. So they deducted the $4,000. So they submitted it for $36,000. When SBA got it, then they deducted the $4,000 again. So then it was down to $32,000. So then they had to submit it. So just make sure you do not subtract that amount. You take the PPP loan amount and then you indicate on your application what the EIDL advance is. So SBA is required to reduce the loan forgiveness amount by the amount of the EIDL advance. And so SBA will deduct that and advise the lender. The lender will confirm the amount of the EIDL advance and will be automatically deducted. Okay, thank you. How should the lender handle any remaining balance due? I'm just kind of reiterating this, but the lender will notify the borrower of the loan forgiveness amount remitted by SBA and the date on which the borrower's first loan payment is due. And the lender must continue to service the loan, and it will be 1% for whatever term that would be. So it's either the 2-year or the 5-year, depending on when you actually applied for the loan. If you applied for it after we made the changes for the 5-year. You always have the option, if the payment is too high and you're on a 2-year note, for whatever reason, hopefully the majority of it or all of it will be forgiven. If it's too high, you have the option to go to the lender and ask them to extend that loan to 5 years. That would be the lender's decision. They may or may not do it, but because ultimately it's the lender's loan, you'll need to work with the lender on that. Next slide, please. So the general forgiveness process, again, it will take SBA 90 days to review. And then if you submitted and they uploaded the documentation, the lender cannot go back and add any more information to that file unless SBA comes back and requests additional documentation as part of that loan package. Then they receive a separate link on where to send additional documentation. So it's very important that you get all that supporting documentation up front. So when you meet with your lender and give them your application, it is a complete package. Okay, so I can't reiterate this enough about how you do not subtract that EIDL from that amount. I did receive a question on one of your questions, Duncan, where somebody said, well, I got 50,000, but my EIDL was 5,000. So now can I use the S form? And no, again, no. If it's over 50,000, you cannot. You have to use the easy form. You can't deduct it and say that's your loan amount. It's the PPP dollar amount, not any subtractions from that. And then if for whatever reason you don't agree with the decision from SBA, then you always have the right to ask for an appeal. Next slide, please. And this is where either Sarah or Roxana is going to be taking this over.
Thanks,
Yes.
Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley. So you can go to the next slide. So our resource partners are available throughout the nation, and I'll be covering 3 in particular that we work with. Now, this one is the Sbdc, and America's Sbdc represents a nationwide network of small business development centers. Sbdcs are hosted by leading universities, college, state economic development agencies, and a private partner, and funded in part by the United States Congress through the partnership with us at the SBA. There are nearly 1,000 local centers available to provide no-cost business consulting and low-cost training to new and existing businesses. And small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs can go to the local Sbdcs for free face-to-face business consulting. Of course, now during COVID, they can do it over the phone or via video chat, and at-cost training on a variety of topics. Learn more about how Sbdcs are helping local businesses start, grow, and thrive. The Small Business Development Centers throughout the country provide expert guidance to help small businesses. They provide services and assistance your business needs throughout the development process, and this includes concepts, startups, and growth. Their statewide network of business coaches partner with you and collaborate with each other to help you move your business to the next level. Many of their coaches have entrepreneurial experience themselves. You can visit them at americassbdc.org, or to locate your local small business development center, go to www.sba.gov/resources. Next slide, please. The next one is SCORE. Now, SCORE's mission is to foster vibrant small business communities through mentoring and education. With the nation's largest network of volunteers, expert business mentors, SCORE has helped more than 11 million entrepreneurs since 1964. SCORE provides a small business reliance hub. They know that disasters and economic downturns bring unprecedented challenges. The Resilience Hub offers training, resources, and remote mentoring to help small business adapt and succeed. Remote SCORE mentors are available, and SCORE mentors are available to work with you remotely via phone, email, and video. This allows you to connect safely with their expert mentors from your home. SCORE is here to support you during this difficult time. They are free and confidential. You can go visit them at www.score.org, or you can find your local SCORE organization at www.sba.gov/resources. Next slide, please. Next is the Women's Business Center. The Women's Business Center works to secure economic justice and entrepreneurial opportunities for women by supporting and sustaining national network of more than 100 women business centers, WBC. WBCs help women succeed in business by providing training, mentoring, business development, and financing opportunities to over 150,000 women entrepreneurs each year. Most states have women business centers, and the women business centers provide one-on-one counseling with experienced business advisors, virtual and in-person training that also assists in obtaining funding and financing. You can find them at www.awbc.org, or to locate your WBC in your area, visit www.sba.gov/resources. Next slide, please. Now we have a
All right.
Q&A. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Kelly.
Can I interject just one? I'm
Please.
sorry. Also with our resource partners, SCORE, Women's Business Center, and the Sbdc are able to assist borrowers in filling out their forgiveness applications, the 3508, 3508 Easy, and S, but they won't fill them out for them. A lender cannot fill them out, nor can an SBA employee fill that out since it's a conflict of interest. But our resource partners are there to assist them if they need it.
And that SCORE in particular, you said, Shelley?
No, all three of them. The
All
Women's
three?
Business Center, SCORE, and the Sbdc, yes.
So that's great to know for everybody. There's another resource there to help you guys figure this out for everyone that can't afford CPAs, which is most of us probably. Okay, excellent. So now let's see. So Andy and everyone, we're going to transition to questions. So you guys asked a lot of great questions in advance of the webinar. We covered some of them. Some are more particular. So let's just jump in. I'll ask the group, and then anyone feel free to answer. But Andy, feel free to jump in and answer specific questions as well. So I think we spent a good amount of time figuring out the difference between EIDL and PPP, and hopefully it's very clear. Do not deduct the EIDL from your PPP at the beginning. One question that seems to be a point of confusion, though, is how will small businesses actually go about paying the EIDL advance back? Because obviously that money that's deducted from PPP needs to be paid back. So what's the process for that going to be?
That's when the lender takes over. So when they submit that application, they deduct the EIDL advance is deducted, leaving a balance. That balance is left with the lender. The lender is making that note at 1% for the term of the loan, 2 or 5 years. So it's the lender that you'll be making payments to, and they'll correspond with you what the payment amount is, the due date, and the term. So
Okay.
it still remains with the lender. You can also, if let's say it's a $2,000 advance and everything was forgiven except that $2,000, the borrower can always go in and just pay that off if they want to, if they have the ability to do so. Otherwise, it flips into the loan.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Can I add something just about the EIDL? Because one of the things when I was looking through the questions that I noticed is that there seems to be a lot of conflation between the EIDL advance and the EIDL loan. So just to because there are a lot of questions about what about the EIDL loan and the EIDL advance? Like an EIDL loan is a loan that you will repay as any other loan. And then the EIDL advance is what we're talking about. So if you're confused and thinking that the EIDL advance and the EIDL loan are one and the same, an EIDL loan is a loan, right? So some people asked about well, 30 years for my EIDL loan, how do I get that forgiven? That's a loan. So that's something different. And I just want to make that point of clarity here.
Yes, there's a significant amount of conflation of that. So it's a very important thing to make sure that
that's a very good point, Andy. Thank you. But so when you are filling out those forms, do not put the loan amount, just the advance amount. And the maximum advance amount is $10,000. It basically was $1,000 per employee. So if you had 2 employees, you'd get $2,000, up to a maximum of 10. So if you had 12 employees, you'd only get a maximum of 10. So it should never exceed that $10,000 on the advance. So don't put the loan amount. Thank you, Andy, for bringing that up.
Great point. So one thing I thought it would be worthwhile, we hit on it a little bit in the deck, but to talk a little bit more about the supporting documentation that needs to be submitted, regardless of which form you're entering, but even just the basic S form. So we talked a little bit about payroll, but how should small businesses package this up? What should be the materials? Obviously it's going to depend on the lender, but just some best practices would probably be worthwhile. Andy, if you had some ideas there.
Well, okay. So I would say, first of all, for some folks, you may look at the supporting document list and not have everything. And so, because not everyone has a canceled check, especially if you pay something electronically. So when you're looking at the supporting document list, it isn't like you have to have every single thing on that list because some of it just may not apply to you. I would say for each way that you've used the funds. So if you've just used it on payroll, then just focus on as many of the payroll supporting documentation that you can get. If you've used it for, payroll plus rent plus utility payments, the process that I would do if I were doing this myself is I would first look at how I've used the funds and the buckets of which I've used the funds. And then I would look at the different type of documents that are considered supporting documents and gather as much as possible. So for payroll, for example, you can bring in your third-party payroll report. So if you're using something like Gusto or another payroll processor, you can run those, right? And then you can also have bank statements. So bank statements that show that this payroll was indeed deducted from your account, right? We have payroll tax filing forms. So those are going to be like the quarterly forms that get filed with the IRS, right? State tax filing form. So I would just go through and do it bucket by bucket because it is really overwhelming to just have this whole list of supporting documentation. And then after that, so once I have as much as I have for payroll, I would move on to, non-payroll related things. So that's again going to vary. There's a lot of different things. I'm wondering if actually, I was going to suggest we listed out in one of the articles that I wrote pretty clearly and bullet pointed, because I do know with the instructions for the forms, it's kind of like one big paragraph and it's hard to even suss what you need. But that would be my recommendation is go bucket by bucket, look at what you have. And if you don't have something like a canceled check, like what's the equivalent to that?
Okay, that's great. And Andy, if you have an article that's relevant that lists all this out, maybe what we should do is drop that into an extra slide on the form that then we circulate to everyone who's been on the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, we'll have Gusto follow up with that because I think that article has some very clear, it like lists it out in a bulleted clear way. And that is what I would go through that list and just, check box my way personally down that list.
Okay. So one thing that I know small business owners have been frustrated about, myself included, having taken a PPP loan, is that a lot of people, and Shelley, you hit on it, that the not real October 31st deadline was one, but in a more general sense, like I took my PPP from, I think, the fourth largest issuer of PPPs, and I have received zero communication about forgiveness whatsoever from them. And so there's a lot of small businesses that want to apply for forgiveness but haven't been given any guidance. And so just wondering if you guys could discuss maybe why so many lenders have not really started that process yet, and when maybe it would get started.
Well, what happened is there was the Senate put out an introduction of a bill for $150,000 or less for forgiveness or simplified. And so a lot of lenders, because if you figure that's probably 70% of all PPP loans in the nation, they were waiting to see if it was one, going to be automatic forgiven, or two, streamlined. So they kind of put the brakes on accepting applications simply because it would be less paperwork for them on their end, especially the community banks that don't have the back support to service all those loans. So they kind of slowed down on that. Anything above 150, they were accepting forgiveness forms on because they figured that would be the requirement. But what came down is the $50,000 or less. And we haven't heard of anything of them exceeding that or going above that or going to the 150, but right now it's at 50,000. So they were kind of waiting on that. And that's the reason why they weren't really accepting applications.
Okay, so it's kind of a wait and see mode.
Yeah, but now they are. Now that we have the 3508S, they are accepting them. Lenders are getting paid and they are being forgiven for the loan. So because there was a 90-day period, there were people that were just on the ball and they submitted their applications quickly. Then the lenders were waiting, and then they finally started submitting them, and now they're just now getting. They started, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, started getting paid on those. And so now, because we came out with the 3508S, there's been a kind of like a mad dash. So the forgiven process has taken a little bit longer, as we said, 90 days, but they've been quicker than 90 days. But a lender today asked me, it's been 3 days, how come I haven't gotten paid? Well, technically we have 90 days, but it could be less than that.
Okay, that's great to know. Andy, I have a specific question for you, which was there's a lot of questions about how to treat PPP and its associated expenses, both the money from PPP and then how it's spent in terms of IRS and taxes. And I was hoping you could just give some highlights about how to consider that for tax purposes.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say that this is the current guidance. You know, things are constantly changing with these guidance. So I want to just put that out there first. You know, something could change before the end of the year, because really what we're talking about is the 2020 tax year, which is like, how do you handle this stuff next year in 2021 when you're filing taxes for this year? So the current guidance is that the PPP loan that's forgiven, so if you receive a PPP loan, let's say you have all of it forgiven, $20,000, and all of that's forgiven, that's not going to be considered taxable income. So you don't report that with like your actual earnings from selling your goods and services. But the flip side to that is that any expenses that you paid for using that forgivable PPP money, that money that's been forgiven, that $20,000, is also not considered a deductible expense, because the IRS will consider that double dipping. So this is why it's really important to track your PPP expenses, both, you know, for the loan forgiveness application and being able to prove that you indeed use these expenses appropriately, or this money appropriately for approved expenses, but also because, and again, I don't know how this is going to work on taxes, if they're just going to be excluded from your tax forms, if there's going to be another form that you report on. We don't know that yet. But what we've heard is that any expense that you used, PPP loan money that was forgiven, will not be considered a deductible expense. So that means if you spent that $20,000 loan all on payroll and that $20,000 was forgiven, that $20,000 payroll expense, you will not also be a tax deduction. That's the current guidance. So of course, we want to keep careful track of how you're using this money. My recommendation, if you are still in the process of using your PPP money, is really to open a separate bank account for it and to put that money in there, and that's going to make the tracking side a lot easier. If you're using like a digital accounting program like QuickBooks or Xero, there are ways that you can tag and classify transactions, and I would tag and classify those transactions as PPP eligible expenses. Again, as much for the loan forgiveness process, but also for the tax process, because we know that, well, we don't know, but we are anticipating that this is how it's going to work next year. So this will be significantly less work on you next year when you're trying to go back through your records and pull out those expenses and deal with that from a record keeping side, if you take proactive steps now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask a question. There's been a lot of anxiety and a lot of very particular questions about FTEs and the cover period. And I'm hoping, Andy, if you could give us some guidance about that. In particular, there's a question about, and Shelley, you sort of hit on it in the presentation, which is when does the covered period end, and about when you spent your money. So let's say, for instance, that you had a 24-week covered period, but you spent all the money in, say, 10 weeks. So can you explain the relationship to the safe harbor, when FTEs need to be restored, and then how long do they need to stay restored, if you understand me? So I hope we could discuss that.
That is a tough question, because I personally don't have that much guidance on that. You know, there are 3 safe harbors, so it's also like a lot. Shelley, if you can speak to, so my understanding is that it's at the end of the 24-week period, or 8 weeks, you know, whatever you decide, whatever you ended up using in your application or when you got your loan, or December 31st was the other piece to that. So that's part of the safe harbors. But then, you know, there's another safe harbor around if you cannot operate at pre-February 15, 2020 levels, and you can prove that you were unable to get your business back up to those operational levels, then you also don't have to restore your FTEs. So this is a little bit of a hard question because there are so many avenues. Shelley, do you have any guidance on the exact end date to those things?
It would be during the covered period, but let's say they did fire somebody for cause. They offered the employee to come back and they refused, or somebody resigned. So they need to have documentation that, one, they were unable to replace that employee, or they refused to come back because during that time, the unemployment benefits in some cases were a lot better than maybe what they were earning. So they refused to come back, but there needs to be documentation that they declined to come back. And so then that could be forgiven on their full-time employee equivalent. So they need to document that. That could be either by, however, mail, certified mail, copy of the letter, email, something that came back and said, and they need to show an effort that we tried to get this person back when they didn't respond, or two, they did respond and said thanks, but no thanks. And then that's part of the Harbor Act, or that they could not include that employee in the full-time equivalent.
And Shelley, I think the question was also around if you submit your loan application prior to the end of the covered period, where is then the FTEs? Where does the FTEs like requirements? Is it the date of your loan forgiveness application? Is it the end of your covered period, even if you've submitted earlier? Is it the end of the year? Like, what is the actual like date that
through the covered period? All those dates on the covered period is either that 8-week or 24, calculating from the day of disbursement to the end. So it's during that covered period.
So the FTE has to be maintained basically to either by the end of the year or through the covered period. Because there's a lot of businesses that have anxiety about this, because maybe they spent the money in 12 weeks, they had FTEs, same amount of FTEs through then, but then business took a turn for the worse and they had to lay off some people, so that by the end of the 24 weeks, they maybe didn't have all those employees. So that's why there's a lot of questions about that particular aspect.
And I don't think that that has been brought up on the frequently asked questions, because they update those as things like this come about. And that scenario hasn't come up. I printed, and there's a couple of frequently asked questions out there. A new one just came out, and normally what they were doing is just adding on to them, but then they created another one. So there's several out there, kind of like the interim final ruling. So in that case, the lender, if the lender doesn't understand it or whatever, they have the email addresses that they can submit to the PPP Forgiveness to get a specific answer on that. So the lenders have the ability to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then could we also speak about, in relation to safe harbors, how can businesses go about proving that they weren't able to operate? So like forced shutdowns and so forth, because there's obviously, Andy, you just hit on that. So what's the best way for a small business owner to do that alongside their application?
I heard at one point, and I don't think that I've seen this somewhere, but if, for instance, here in our state, our governor mandated that all restaurants be closed. So it's just proof that it was government mandated that they could not open. And they said that documentation would be fine.
Yeah, and some other thoughts that I had, because I looked for this information when this question came up, and there isn't really any like list provided, but some things that I had written down that may be like similar or useful is, government mandates, either your state or your county. And so you should be able to go on your state or your county's like COVID site, and they will have those posted. Reopening phase timelines, especially if they pertain to your industry. So you can show, from this period to this period, we were in red, orange, yellow, whatever. Another thing is like capacity restrictions, if those apply to your business. You could also, from like, this is more of like a financial data point of view, but also sales reports showing that, you had a decline in sales reflects these government mandates as well. So that's kind of like the flip side of like the cause and effect between these two.
Oh, that's an excellent point.
And then on the easy form, I believe it's box number 3, you check that you're unable to operate during the covered period, the same level of business activity as before February 15th. So you're selecting that, and you can also get supporting documentation from maybe OSHA or the CDC as well.
Oh, that's a good point. Thank you for that. I have another question. So there's unfortunately a lot of businesses that are planning to close, have closed, or maybe will need to. And if we could talk a little bit about the process for how to handle this situation for a business that's closing. Is there anything different about applying for forgiveness, or if you don't get your entire forgiveness granted, but the business is then closed, how should small business owners handle that sort of situation?
Well, if they've used some of the funds for what it was intended for, so payroll, but then they still weren't able to run their business and they decide to close, but they've used the funds, they could still apply for forgiveness and it'll be forgiven. If they don't submit the documentation, it is a loan, it turns into the loan. At that point, and we haven't received direction on this, but SBA is guaranteeing those loans at 100%, which means that then the lender would send something different for us to honor that guarantee rather than the forgiveness. So the forgiveness and honoring the guarantee are basically two separate things. But there hasn't been any guidance on that particular thing right now. Normally, when we do a regular SBA loan, SBA guarantees that loan for the lender. If the borrower defaults on that, then the lender submits a package asking us to honor the guarantee, and then we pay whatever the percentage is on that, 75, 85, whatever it is. But in this case, on the forgiveness, it is 100% forgivable, up to 100% forgivable. But we haven't reached the point where if it isn't forgivable, how does a lender ask for that, and what are the process for it? So we're still kind of waiting for guidance on that because we haven't quite reached that, but it is a common question that comes up that businesses are closing.
But main point for right now seems to be that even if you're closing or have closed, still submit your forgiveness application to get as much of that approved as possible.
Absolutely, because if it's forgiven, then it's done. If it's partial, it'll still turn into a loan. And then at that point, they can continue to work with the lender on that. Whether they want to make payments, and if they refuse, then at that point the lender has to contact SBA to figure out if we're gonna what the process is to for SBA to guarantee that.
Okay. So I was just going to ask maybe one or two more questions because we started a little bit late and there's so many. One question, this kind of came, I think, out of what you said about home office expenses not being, if you work from home, not being eligible.
Right.
One question that came up is, what about, so, you know, the IRS, different tax policies we're getting to how much of your home expenses are eligible for to be called business costs. I was wondering, what about home mortgages? That's a question that we got. Is there any?
No.
No.
Home mortgages, no, you cannot. The only mortgages is the business mortgage. And
Okay.
then if there's any lease payments on the business, but home mortgages, no.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that.
And then so I noticed that somebody asked about phone bills. And yes, those are considered not your home phone, but like your cell phone that you use for business, that is considered a business expense.
Okay. We got one question. Just wanted to clarify this one. It's a similar to the EIDL and PPP question about don't subtract the EIDL from the PPP in the amount you're applying for. Someone said, I received a $47,500 PPP and a $3,000 EIDL advance. So the total amount is $50,500 that they received. Is that still eligible for the S form?
The 47,500 is eligible. You don't include that PPP. You just put that in there. It's not added together, and do not subtract it. SBA will subtract it for. So the amount that you would apply for is a 47,500.
Great. So the bottom line there is basically the S form only relates to the exact amount of the PPP. So disregard whatever your EIDL advance was when seeing if you're eligible for that form.
You have to, on all three forms, you have to indicate what your EIDL advance was.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, you don't add it or subtract it at all. You take your PPP loan, and that's your total amount that you're asking for forgiveness. Do not add or subtract that advance to it. nor the loan, the idle loan.
Okay. One question, this is sort of idle focus, but obviously related, is there's some people that have an anxiety. What if I took an idle advance, but then didn't end up taking an idle loan? Will I need to pay back the idle advance?
My understanding is no.
Okay, that seems to be the general understanding, but I wanted to clarify. Okay, so just to wrap up here, I want to tell everyone that we're going to be sending around the deck that Shelley presented. Andy and Gusto are going to send around an article that has the checklist of the documentation for your supporting documentation for the forgiveness application. And then we are going to send around two things. We're going to send out a recording of this webinar. We have to edit it, so expect it tomorrow. And then we're also going to send around some answers that Gusto and the SBA provided for several of the questions that you ask in a document so that you can actually reference them. And so that's going to be the follow-up materials, but I just want to take a moment to thank all the attendees, and a special thank you to Andy, Shelley, Roxana, and Sarah for helping us out. I found this very productive.
So Duncan, can I add one more thing?
Please.
Since we have business owners, borrowers from all over the nation, you can also contact your local SBA office. So you can Google it, SBA /resources, find the SBA office in your area, and they can assist you and or one of the resource partners. But we have in every single state SBA offices all over the place. So use that as a resource as well to get in touch with somebody there, local in your area.
It's great advice. Well, thank you all again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.